So what arguments do you think convince you that there are no gods? Obviously, we have a bit of a different starting point, as I mentioned. I I grew up going to a Christian school, saying the Lord's Prayer every day, singing hymns, and um, went to Sunday school a couple of times and didn't go again because I didn't like it. um, you obviously never believed, and you were sent to Sunday school by your nana or gran, and you were sent home from, from the first ever time that you went as a devil child.
Yeah.
And I spent some time dipping in and out of different religions, but ultimately finding them all unconvincing to a point where eventually I ended up believing there were no gods. Um, Whereas you've probably always been in that position.
Yeah.
So I
Um,
suppose for you, it's more people going, well, why don't you believe this particular claim rather than you exploring it in the first instance?
as a kid, yeah, it was more learning to answer why I didn't believe. And as I got older, I started looking more into the arguments. And because I was being introduced to more arguments, I had to learn more and more and more. So really, it sort of sent me off on my path towards enjoying philosophy, which is I'm pretty grateful for.
Hmm. Definitely. So I suppose originally your arguments would have probably been against the Christian God, though.
Yeah, because that was the dominant god in the social structures.
Um, so from there, what were some of the things that were originally said to you?
How do you mean?
So the original questions that why don't you believe this? What about this? What as a kid? And obviously this is going to be probably a weaker justification than you can justify now. But what were some of the justifications you used to give to some of the critique you got for your disbelief?
It was pretty simplistic stuff, but mostly based on the problem of evil,
Hmm.
uh, divine hiddenness, but very simplistic sort of version of it. Obviously, I was like 10, um, and the existence of different religions and things like that, and how it looked like society. It was the kind of thing that society just did was make up gods.
There you go, Philip. You said divine hiddenness. I was waiting to see if Dave brought it up himself without me throwing it in the mix because he said it a couple of times in the chat. I wasn't ignoring you. I was just seeing if it came up.
Yeah, and I mean, I still kind of hold to those three. Like the divine hiddenness is something I still hold to. The problem of evil, but in a different sense. Generally, when people talk about problem of evil, I'll tell them it's not a particularly good argument. That's because they know only the most simplistic versions, and the theists will always have an answer to those simplistic versions. It's good justification for yourself, but arguing it with the theist is a different matter, and you've really got to know the arguments.
Okay, so I mean, why don't you take us through a couple of these arguments? You don't have to obviously take us through a 2 hour lecture for each, but just give us a basic overview.
Well, there's the logical problem of evil, which is the idea that a perfectly good God would want only good things, a perfectly just God would only want just things, and the sort of contradictory attributes leading to it not being logically possible for God to exist.
Hmm.
And that generally tends to be the main one that a lot of the atheists today use. Um, and they'll argue from the existence of certain evils. But as Plantinga argued, you can always argue that these things are being done in the name of a greater purpose. So there's always that out. You might not be able to explain why 6 million Jews had to be killed in the Holocaust. It might seem evil to you, but God has a plan, and you can't understand this plan. So it can always be written off. Um, but then you have the evidential problem of evil, which is evil in the existence of like horrendous evil, horrendous suffering, things that you wouldn't necessarily be able to write off that easily, like animal suffering or the worms that burrow into a child's eyes so that they can be born. There doesn't seem to be any specific thing that we can learn from something like this. Um, and it counts as evidence against God's existence,
Mm-hmm. That
unless
one,
it's an evil God.
that one actually came up with Philip in a conversation with someone. I think it was yesterday, wasn't it, Philip? We briefly skimmed around that particular one, but yeah, that it makes a lot of sense. Then you mentioned define hiddenness. Did you want to take us through that one briefly?
It's basically the idea that God can't reveal himself or God is hidden. The universe appears to be a universe without a God. Um, Divine hiddenness is just the idea that God keeps himself hidden purposefully. And, what's the difference? You know, if God is keeping himself purposefully hidden from me, then he doesn't want me to love him, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. So that's not necessarily an argument, perhaps against, say, a deist god, um,
Well,
or
that's still a God of divine hiddenness.
yes,
Um,
but it is. Yeah, I'm just saying, if you're talking about a personal god, it's more of an argument against personal gods.
Oh yeah, yeah. But divine hiddenness still talks about the idea that we can't see God, manifest itself in our universe. So what's the difference between the two gods? Why should I have reason to believe that this God exists? Doesn't it seem more likely that it doesn't if we have to excuse its not appearing in reality?
Yep, preaching to the choir, man. And you mentioned a third argument, but it's jumped out of my mind. What was that?
Oh, the argument from psychology,
Okay, and what's that one?
where it's in our nature to create gods. If you think about the different iterations that gods have gone through, we can see sort of like in the polytheists where they're figuring out a way to control their environment. They pray to such and such a god to have the rain, such and such a god to have the harvest. They're looking for ways to control the environment. And we can see religions evolve in different places, all with similar kind of ideas behind them. Um, it just seems to be in our nature to create these versions of gods to help us navigate our way through society and the world better.
There's actually an argument from evolutionary biology to explain this. I think I've included it in a couple of articles in the past, and it's we're prone to assign agency. So it was an evolutionary survival trait. You know, you're out for a walk trying to do your hunting and gathering and whatever. There's a rustle in the bush, and the people that assume that it's a lion and either prepare to fight or run away have a higher chance of surviving than those that go, probably nothing. And that sort of assigning agency to natural things sort of led to a superstition. Oh, well, we didn't bless this tree and now it's died, so the god must be mad, or some creature, some entity. And that superstition obviously then started building into these religions, and then it goes into what you're saying about controlling the environments, controlling the rains. We did this dance and the rain came, so therefore there must be a god that decides that doing this dance, don't know why that's a dance. There you go. I think I was banging on the drums, rain drums, but apparently my drums are up here.
You're only tiny and have big drums. But yeah, that's essentially the idea that it seems to be God is a creation of man. Of course, they all don't necessarily show that God does not exist, but I think that you add on to that something like naturalism seems to explain all of these things in a more parsimonious in a better way than theism does as well. So it leads me to believe that it's more likely than not that God does not exist, rather than any outright claim that.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I think there are certain claims of gods as they're written that are as illogical as a square circle. But I think in general, I'm with you. I'm not going to outright and say that there's definitely no gods. Just that I believe there's no gods. I think it's unlikely that gods exist. I think another thing we could come back is, sort of naturalistic arguments and things like that, which I think that there's plenty of models that show no real need for a god to actually exist.
Exactly.
So, yeah, I think that is definitely a big one for me. I also think another one is how many different gods and god claims that there are around the world. There is an overwhelming sort of lack of consistency. They can't all be right. So, especially the ones that are saying, well, no, there's definitely only one God. So, if they can't all be right, it's probably more likely that they're all wrong. I know that's a bit of a stretch, but this is just part of a formulation of my overall argument.
Yeah.
I think that the lack of clarity in religions, the fact that you end up having them breaking off into so many different denominations, arguing over these perfect texts. I mean, if this is really a divinely inspired work, then why is it so argued over? Surely it should be able to be, oh no, this is definitely it. If we've got, especially if you're going for an all-powerful, all-knowing style God, surely it could give us a book that would not be argued over. It surely. And then you've got errors in holy books, and there are errors in the holy books. Again, surely if it's divinely inspired, there'd be stuff in there that no one could possibly know at that time, and it would be correct. But it's not. I mean, there's so many little things, be they historical errors or moral errors or whatever, or contradictions in books and things like that. I think they add to the fact that, well, there's definitely something wrong with this book. It doesn't necessarily say that this book wasn't based on telling a story about a particular deity, but I think that is one of the big ones for me that just says, oof. And also testimony, not even talking about testimony, say, within the Bible, but people's experiences that they have, their anecdotes of gods. They've got so many different contrary testimonies as well, about their experience of a deity. And I do think that there's a big part of most gods come to by some form of presupposition or fallacy, well, we don't know, therefore it's got to be a god. I can't explain this thing, so therefore it's a god. Which I think, again, is tied back to how, well, we don't know why the rains come, but it seems to be when we bang the drums. And it's now, we can explain all of these different things with the different weather patterns, but it's now, well, I don't know how the Big Bang happened, so therefore God. And it moves it back. The gaps are definitely getting smaller and smaller and smaller, but there's still that, well, we don't know this thing. So therefore we're gonna shoehorn it in there. That's where it goes. That's where it goes. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I think they're probably, along with what you said, they're my main ones. One that I will say comes up to me is an overwhelming lack of credible, consistent evidence. And an overwhelming lack of coherent and consistent definitions of gods. Both of those. I'm not saying there's no evidence. I will say that the Bible and the Quran and the Vedas and all of that are evidence. They're just contrary evidence. But they are evidence because evidence is indicative, just not good evidence. So that's why I say there's an overwhelming lack of credible evidence. Just to put that one out there, because I know plenty of atheists out there will go, it's not evidence. Andy and I got in a conversation with someone in a group today. They went, well, this evidence wouldn't count in a court, so it's not evidence. So, just because the evidence would be inadmissible in a court doesn't make it not evidence.
Yeah.
um, uh,
Well, there are two kind of big ones for me as well. The evidence seems to point towards the gods in holy text to be fictional entities. Um, the evidence seems to point towards a more physicalist sort of expression in the universe. There doesn't seem to be supernatural entities. And we've looked in places where we should have found them and not found them. And it's the same, sort of the same with God, where we look to see evidence of God's intervening in the natural order. We can either use Hume's argument for miracles, in that we have no good reason to believe any testimony about miracles going back in the past. And in the present times, whenever they've been examined, it's been shown to be a leaky toilet or something like that. So I know it's a bit of an inductive argument, but the constant failure to provide that kind of evidence to show that God is more likely leads me to believe that God doesn't exist. I know we've got apologetic arguments. We can come to them in a bit. And the other thing is sort of the atheist stance, in that God is an incoherent concept. And the fact that all of them seem to be incoherent leads me to believe that it's just an attempt by humans to create a concept that explains things.
Yeah, that's definitely a big one for me. I think I can't remember who made the quote as well on your first point. There's never been something scientific that has then become explained by something supernatural, but it's gone the other way. There's things that have been perceived to be supernatural that have then been later explained by something completely natural. Again, I mean, all of these arguments sort of tie into each other. You could say that we're saying the same thing in different ways for some of the points, and I guess we are, but that's because all of these arguments work together to form the disbelief. That's why it's not simply lacking belief, and that's why we don't actively believe gods exist. It's why we believe gods don't exist, and all of these arguments sort of work together.
Well, that's it. It's sort of like, if you think of something like the Kalam is the way William Lane Craig uses it. He makes a cumulative argument, in that it's argument after argument that builds up the strength of the probability. And that's basically how I see arguments for the belief God does not exist. It's not a particular knockdown argument that goes, yep, there you go. It's accumulation of all different things that all seem to work together to come to a stronger case than theism does.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if we didn't believe that, we'd be theists, probably.
Yeah. And I mean, I'll admit that there are some arguments from theism that make me go, okay, yes, that is an argument in theism's favor. It just doesn't convince me.
Yeah. I mean, there are some times when I find myself wowed when I start thinking about the planet and how it's moving through space and spinning round and going round a sun, and the sun's also sort of moving like this through space, and I sit there just going, oh, the fuck, what happens if it just stops? And oh my god, and it just keeps going and going, and it's amazing the way everything works. And I can understand being in absolute awe of the universe and thinking, wow, something's got to be controlling this. It can't just be random. But then that's just an argument from incredulity. And it's, at the end of the day, why can't it? Oh, well, it just can't. Okay, then.
Yeah. Well, I mean, here's another one in that, kind of like you just mentioned, where some Christians will look and just based on looking around, they'll go, well, it just appears that God exists to me. And that's usually taken as a reasonable justification. So, for the case for it not to be special pleading, you would also then have to accept that just looking out and not seeing evidence for a God is sufficient justification to believe that it is the case that there is no God.
Mm.
And that's another one of my justifications, in that the world I experience just doesn't seem to be something that I would kind of consider as being divine.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, even the concept of divinity, I find a bit incongruent. Anyway,
Yeah.
so it doesn't seem to fit what people say it is, and it doesn't seem to be particularly good.
Yeah.
So hang on, let me just have a quick look at the chat. Cool, there's loads of them in there. I do apologize for not keeping up to date with all of you. Let's have a look. Going down them. You asked a fundy relative on what he thinks to him the argument is stupid, and I'm like, you clearly said the homework done. So that's talking about the argument from divine hiddenness. In reverse Lactheist. Yeah, LB says Lactheists are the product of that fundy Christian upbringing. Look at Matt, Aaron, and Paul Ogia, and many others. I mean, I think that is a big part of it. Why you get people who have had this serious harm done to them, felt this serious harm, felt stupid that they believe this thing, and they're trapped in a world that they can't control. I mean, I think Philip and I were having a chat with someone yesterday. It was the meme guy I was talking about earlier. And he's clearly had a bad experience and continues to have a bad experience. I think in some respects, being in England, we're quite lucky. Even though I went to Christian schools and had to say the Lord's Prayer every day and all of that, it's generally not considered a big deal. So I'm sitting here and I don't feel the same harm and aggression towards religion that some people do. The only thing I would say, though, is even though you feel harmed by it, in a way, that's your issue. And if you genuinely want to do something about the religious side of things in your culture, attacking isn't going to do anything to make it better. You'd be better off trying to have rational conversations and convincing people that at the very least they shouldn't believe, or certain parts of the Bible are clearly immoral because so on and so forth, or whatever. Philip says, the formal version of Hiddenness by John Schellenberg. P1, if God exists, there are no non-resistant non-believers. P2, there are non-resistant non-believers. Conclusion, therefore God does not exist. But that is more specific to a non-deistic God. It has to be to that loving God. Yeah, especially if it's a loving God that threatens you with hell if you don't believe. LB said, I would argue that God is not supposed to be personal. I know, but that's because you're a deist. I mean, logically supreme being like God only guides and sustains the universe, but not the earth. So yeah, I mean, I understand where you're coming from. Then I think the way we've addressed some of the claim that with our arguments, that it's almost like with what you're saying there is no real difference between the deist God existing and not, because if it's all natural process or it's a hidden process, then it amounts to much the same thing. It's like I was saying, my awe of the universe and the way it works and how my mind is blown by it when I sit back and think about it. I can sit there and go, wow, that must be a God. Or I can sit there and go, but why? There's no reason to think it's a God. There's no reason to think it's not a natural process. And if you trace things back to the Big Bang and move on forward, it's lots of little small iterations that became more and more complex over time. And that seems far more logical to me than actually going, well, yeah, clearly a God did it. But I can understand why people do think that. You also say, before you forget, Andrew, right? He said, you both give good points for reasons not to accept God claims, but they aren't sufficient to claim there is no God. I would say I don't claim that there's no gods. I'd say I believe there are no gods. I would give my justifications as I just did before. So I would say that there are certain gods that I would probably claim don't exist based on how they're described, because they seem so logically inconsistent that, as I said, it's like a square circle. It just can't exist. But that doesn't mean that it couldn't be based on something. But I think all the justifications that we've given so far are enough to believe there are no gods. They've definitely convinced us.